think, or whatever there, you'll be able to
I see. There's private chat and live comments. Got it. Okay.
Yes. Okay. And it's this Chris guy who keeps going on about something, but anyway, I don't know what the fuck he's referring to, so I'm not even going to touch it.
Yeah.
Anyway, let's do this. Oh, we're live. I guess I already hit the button. Hey, hi everyone. Welcome to another edition of Deconversion Stories. Today I'm talking with the amazing Dr. Richard Carrier. You guys know him. I'm sure you know him. He's a huge Jesus mythicist, I guess we could say. Your books like on the historicity of Jesus and stuff like that, which I actually have that and another one of your titles in my Audible book collection, by the way. But I do want to get a hard copy because if we ever run into each other, I'm going to get you to sign it for me.
Yeah, I'd love that. Right.
But anyways, so Richard and I were talking a little bit before we went live here, and he's got quite the interesting story. And we're going to be talking a little bit about what he does nowadays with the whole mythicism stuff and whatnot. So, but let's get into the deconversion stuff. So yeah, just I guess reiterate what we were talking about and kind of expand a little bit on it for me.
Yeah, I'm probably different from most of your previous guests. I tell my story for people who want to know all the details. I tell this story in my book, Sense and Goodness Without God. The early sections of that, I talk about my background and how I got into this and so on. But I started in Southern California in a super liberal Christian church, and my family were kind of, my mom was like the church secretary, and I went to Sunday school and all this stuff. But it was super liberal. Like they would teach. I've talked about this many times. So they would teach like Bible stories and like ancient Greek myths next to each other, and not really even convey that there was a difference. And to them, it was like, oh, it's the moral of the story. It's like, it wasn't like literal truth. It was like, what can you learn from these stories kind of thing. And so it was very low dogma, very high, like just be nice to each other kind of, liberal Christianity. So I didn't even know about fundamentalism or any of conservative Christianity. That came later in life. And at first I thought it was just like a fringe thing. And it was only when I became a voter that I started to realize that they actually run things, and it's pretty terrible. And then interacted with them online. I was among the early bulletin board inhabitants back in the early days of the internet. But
me too, man. Me too. The old BBS days.
Yeah, 300 baud modem.
Right. I remember freaking out. Hang on, I remember freaking out when they hit like 900 baud. I was like, "Yes, finally some speed!" And it still took half a day for a picture.
Oh, it's inconceivable now. I remember 2600 was like, that's unbelievable. That's crazy talk. And
it's like light speed.
Now it's like gig. It's in gigs, right? So it's like crazy. And we couldn't be doing this like this.
No, not a chance.
So I wasn't really a believer per se. Like I had sort of a vague notion that there was a God when I was a kid, and at the same time though, I would like talk. I thought trees had souls and I could talk to them. Like that was like it was all of a piece, right? So I wasn't really affected by. I never had a bad experience in that sense with religion, and even in high school when I did encounter conservatives. They were always like a super minority, and we just thought they were weirdos and we would laugh at them. I remember there was one conservative Christian girl that a friend of mine was dating, and he literally had her in tears over the fact that he wouldn't give up the belief that there might be life on other planets. And really? We just thought that was just silly. And, so we were very naive at that back then, but it was later that I became much more exposed to how they drive politics and social policy and the damage they do to human lives. And but what happened to me in high school, early high school, maybe freshman year, I can't remember exactly what year it was, but I was what Christian evangelists would call a seeker. I was like, oh, I have all these anxieties about the world and stuff. What is true, and what is the meaning of life? Yada yada. And I had this moment where I was in a bookstore. And I just had this feeling, and it was just like right out of Augustine. If you ever read Augustine's story of his conversion, it was just like that. It's like I had this feeling I need to turn around, and I don't know where that feeling came from. I turned around, and the first book I saw was the Tao Te Ching, and I pulled it off the shelf, and I felt the urge to just pick a random page. And I picked a random, opened it up, and read the stanza there. And I don't remember what stanza it was. This is so long ago, but it spoke so perfectly to my situation is like, this had to be a miracle. There's no way like this could be just chance coincidence. And so then I assiduously went into studying Taoism, studied the Tao Te Ching principally, but also the Chuang-Tzu's treatise. And then I went into meditation. So I was doing Taoist meditation. I had a lot of hallucinatory experiences through, sleep deprivation and meditative and altered consciousness. And had really convinced myself that I was one with the Tao, that the Tao was a real thing. And that it was proved by these religious experiences that I was having, and also by how it reformed my life. Like, it made me a much calmer, nicer person. And so it's like everything you hear from a Christian saying, it did all these things for me. Jesus did all these things for me. That's why you should have Jesus. And it's like, it was the Tao did all these things to me. Exactly the same. And it was like later, that actually gave me a perspective when I started hearing Christians telling me this. Is like, oh yeah, I everything you're describing, I know intimately from Taoism. It's like it was the same thing. So it's very clear, right? It's very clear that the doctrines didn't matter. Like there was something else going on psychologically in people's beliefs when they make these kinds of arguments for belief. Sure. Now that was my belief, and it did me well. It taught me a lot. I still benefit from the philosophy that I learned from that time. But when I went into the Coast Guard, early military experience, gradually, I was still reading in the sciences. I was a science nerd from way back. And so I was always reading the sciences. And I started reading more Confucianism, which is the alternate, like the Taoists and the Confucians argue against each other. They're kind of like Christians and Jews.
Do they?
Really? Yeah. Well, yes, they have opposing philosophies, but they're more friendly than Western religions are.
There's not a lot of slaughter going on, I guess.
Well, yeah, actually, and it's a cultural thing. This was I think I mentioned this in Sense and Goodness Without God, but there's a famous painting. Well, I mean, it's an image. It's reproduced many times and by different artists, but it's all over China and in East Asia. It's a very popular image to see and have, which you see these three old men walking and laughing together down a road, and it's Lao Tzu, Confucius, and Buddha. And it just illustrates like, oh yeah, we all get along, we have arguments, we have disagreements, but we're not at each other's throats. And that was very much defined Chinese religion. If you look at the history of China, like you have to go after the influence of Western religions on China before you find actual religious conflict, like based on you get some anti-Buddhist action in the Chinese Middle Ages and things like that. But when you go back to Han Dynasty, like that wasn't a thing. Like you could have all of these different groups disagreeing and get along with each other and so on.
Sure. Yeah.
And that was kind of, a thing that affected me too. Like that was a positive image to grow up with or to, instill in myself and so on. But in the Coast Guard, I was realizing that sometimes the Confucians were right and sometimes the Taoists are wrong. Like I didn't agree with some of the philosophy in there. There's just some things, but it was enough things for me to realize that this wasn't divinely inspired. This was just some dude in ancient China who wrote some cool shit. And that was right. And, he had some brilliant stuff. There's a lot of brilliant stuff in there, but, and it might not have been one guy. That's the other thing. Tao Te Ching may have been written by multiple people. We don't know.
Right. That's right.
But it doesn't matter. The point being is like some of it's human wisdom. So some of it's genius. Some of it is so, some of it is bad and so on. And then the science. So I was starting to realize like, oh, I'm hallucinating. Right. So I had better understanding of how sleep deprivation affects this and how altered states of consciousness can be instilled by meditation and so on. So then I fell out of belief basically in the Coast Guard, and I still I didn't have anything else to go on. So I was still a Taoist nominally. But then I was like, well, then what? So that was my thing is like, well, if this isn't true, what is? And so I became a much more focused seeker. Now I'm thinking worldview. How do I find alternative worldviews? And my interest was Western philosophy. I dived into that and atheism. So I started looking for atheist literature. Now this is 1992. There wasn't a lot of atheist literature. It was really hard to find an atheist book back then. Bookstores, if you're lucky, maybe we'll have Bertrand Russell's Why I'm Not a Christian. And probably only a used bookstore would. Like it was really hard. And that's what I found. I found Corliss Lamont's Philosophy of Humanism and Bertrand Russell's Why I'm Not a Christian. And that I found those. And that was my introduction to atheist literature, but it was hard back then to find stuff. Yeah. And then when me and my Coast Guard buddies we went to the Castro Street Fair in San Francisco. And I don't know if you know the cultural history of the Castro Street Fair, but that's a super liberal fair. Definitely
I'm
not right. Definitely not friendly to conservative Christians. But there was a booth. Someone was boothing for American Atheists, and my friend said, "Hey, look, American Atheists. Well, that's you." And I'm like, "Oh yeah, that is me." And then I go up, and that's how I found them. And then through them, I found FFRF, the Freedom from Religion Foundation. Then I started publishing. Then I was contacted by the Secular Web, because then it existed eventually by 95 after the Coast Guard. The Secular Web existed and asked, can we publish some of your stuff? And so then I got involved with the Secular Web, became a feedback editor, then eventually became editor-in-chief. And I'm no longer with them, but I'm an emeritus editor-in-chief for them, because I worked on Secular Web and with those guys for so many years back then, back in the day. And anyway, that just led eventually to me publishing and becoming more active as an atheist philosopher, an atheist writer. But also in the Coast Guard, when I lost my faith, I started writing a book about what my beliefs are, like what replaces it. And that book changed constantly over the years, but that book eventually became Sense and Goodness Without God, which I published in 2005, and still holds up pretty well. I have one article on my blog that's typos and Sense and Goodness Without God, that goes into like what I would fix or change, but it's small things generally. And so anyway, that's my whole story, and I got myself out. Like, this wasn't like I wasn't encountering anti-Taoists like arguing that I should not be a Taoist. I sort of like figured it out myself. And then when I got more and more involved in like combating Christian right people, especially in political issues, but also in that got me into the religion and stuff. And so I didn't have the background that a lot of people have, like a lot of anger and resentment that they were raised conservative and then were outraged at how when they find out how they were lied to, like all these lies they were told, they have this sort of resentment and anger, like they're very anti-theistic. And I didn't have that experience. Like, I came to it as just the logical outsider saying, like, this doesn't make any sense, why are you doing this? And so I have a different background than most people do. Through my deconversion story is given me a different background. And it gave me this interesting analogy now that I can see through the lens of Taoism everything Christians are talking about. So I can see how delusion works, because I was in this delusion myself, but it was in a different dogma. So that was super useful. I'm kind of glad of that. My backstory, it's been handy for me, actually.
Yeah, no doubt, to be able to look, through a different belief system lens to see just how, I don't want to say irrational, but I think you nailed it with the delusional part about how these other folks are, eat that up and not realize that they're not putting enough critical thought into it. Now, shit, I was going to ask you something and it fell out of my head now. Fuck, I hate it when this happens. Anyway, so how did you end up getting into the Jesus mythicism bit? Oh yeah,
not a trajectory I expected.
Not like a link there. You know what I mean? Like,
well, it's kind of just accident, really. I wouldn't have gone that way. So when I was editor-in-chief of the Secular Web, I was still going through graduate school. I was still doing my PhD in. At the time, ancient history, ancient science was my subject, but also specializing in ancient religion and ancient philosophy, basically ancient intellectual history.
Okay.
And I was a historicist. Like, I was like, of course, there was just a generic, mundane Jesus, and I was this legend and myth piled on top. And my first exposure to the Jesus myth stuff was all this crazy, stupid stuff that was easily debunkable. Kersey Graves kind of like 16 crucified saviors stuff. And I even wrote an article for Secular Web about this is why you can't trust this kind of literature. Just don't fall for this. And there's a lot of really bad arguments out there. But several people who I respected, whose judgment I respected, told me like, oh, okay, there's one author you should take seriously. And they said, it's Earl Doherty. He doesn't do this crank stuff. He has a different argument for the non-existence of Jesus that actually looks plausible. So would you like do a review of it, since you're doing your dissertation in ancient history? You would be the right person to like look at it. And I looked at that and I wrote I wrote an article about it. It's still available. You can get it on. It was long ago. I can't remember, 2003 maybe. It's quite some time ago. I took it as like, well, if this were a dissertation and I were his dissertation advisor, what would I say?
Mhm.
And I said it's almost a passable dissertation. Like there was a list of things I would say, if you fix these things, it would pass as a dissertation for sure. I was surprised at how good it was, actually. Like this is a guy who only has a BA in classics. Not a PhD, and he's doing almost PhD level quality work. Not flawless. There were issues, but I was surprised basically, and I realized like his argument is an argument that no one's really responded to. Like the historicists, the mainstream scholars don't have an answer to it really, or at least not a good one, or at least wasn't one that was obvious to me. And so I said, well, okay, at least it looks like a hypothesis you should take seriously. But I wasn't a convinced mythicist at that point. I was like, well, maybe not. But I'm going to side with the consensus at this point. And that's where I would have stayed. I would have stayed. That would have been my. Everyone asked me about this. I said, well, that's what I think. But that's all I would have done for the rest of my career. But in 2008, I got my PhD. But that, of course, is 2008 when the economy collapsed. Right. So this freezes on hires for humanities professors. Like it was almost impossible to get a humanities job then. And so I had about $20,000 left over of student debt I needed to get canceled. And so I went to my fans and said, well, if you can raise enough money to cancel my student debt, I'll apply my PhD to any subject you want, whatever it is. And they unanimously said historicity of Jesus, and they raised the money. So I was like, well, wow, this is what I'm doing.
I should try this.
Yeah, for that. Well, this was before Kickstarter and stuff. So it was kind of like what I'm doing was kind of like a Kickstarter thing. Right. But yeah, so I did. It took me 6 years to complete that project. So $20,000 divided by 6. It's not a lot of money. No, that's but pretty good. It kept me doggedly working on it, and it resulted in multiple books, multiple peer-reviewed journal articles, and so on. And then that led to me being, and this is part of the deal with my fans who basically created a postdoc research grant is basically what they did for me. The deal was I would get something passed through peer review one way or another, whether it was pro-historicity or anti or whatever. And that is On the Historicity of Jesus. That book got published by Sheffield Phoenix, which was published off the campus of the University of Sheffield in England. At the time, it was staffed by faculty from the University of Sheffield. It was peer-reviewed, the whole deal. It's a respected biblical studies press. And so I was the first person to get this theory ever passed through peer review. In 100 years at least. And in fact, I was the first person to publish any book specifically on the historicity of Jesus, pro or con, in almost 100 years. Like the last one was Shirley Jackson Case arguing for historicity against early mythicists, the German mythicists back then, in 1923. So 1923, that's the most recent book, peer-reviewed, the most recent peer-reviewed academic monograph arguing for the historicity of Jesus. There have been a couple that came out recently, like in the 21st century, but they weren't peer-reviewed books. They're pop market books by Bart Ehrman and Maurice Casey that are just terrible books, shockingly terrible books. But I have reviews of them on my blog if you want to check them out. But so that's how I ended up. And then, of course, being the only author who's done this, at the time being the only author who's done this, now Raphael Lataster has just published another book arguing for historicity agnosticism with Brill, which is another major academic publisher. So he's got it. So we have 2 peer-reviewed books arguing for the non-existence of Jesus, or at least for the plausibility of the non-existence of Jesus. And so anyway, that sort of led to me being like the go-to guy for this. And so I have a lot of people who are interested in the subject who follow my work. And so I write more on it. All the arguments get thrown at me. Like, so if like there's we have some new argument, or did you think of this? What about this? And, criticisms of my book, arguments in my book, and so on. So it's just become part of my career to like discuss and examine and continue dealing with the historicity of Jesus as a thing. And so that's now one of my fields. But I still do all the traditional atheist stuff. I just recently published an article on PragerU's videos arguing for God, where I deconstruct the philosophy of that. So I'm still doing like traditional atheist, argumentation and writing, in addition to the historicity of Jesus. But I also write on ancient science and Christian apologetics and the connection to science and various other subjects. So I've done a lot of other things. I even published an article for German Studies Review on Hitler's Table Talk, which has actually changed the field of Hitler studies, because now I've exposed the only English translation is invalid. So I do a lot of other things. It's just this one gets a lot of attention because it's so controversial.
I had no idea about the Hitler one, actually.
Yeah, a lot of people don't know that one. But yeah, I have. You can go on my blog and check it out. I have various blog articles I've written on because I do updates. Because there's a professor in Sweden who's doing a whole Dan Brown thing on it, where he's like digging through archives and talking to surviving witnesses and stuff. Like he's like collecting histories that were inspired by my GSR article. Right. So that's another thing that's kind of very niche that you'll find me footnoted in like various books about Hitler's religion, you see, and footnote Richard Carrier. So it's that's a whole other story as to how that happened. But the point being is I do a lot of other things, but it's the Jesus myth stuff is where I get a lot of attention and where my name gets out there a lot.
Yeah, I think that's it's been my experience. And when I talk to people about what you do, that's always what they tend to refer to. Because I think that's mostly what they see on things like YouTube, is you out there arguing these cases. That's
true. Yeah, I've done a few. Yeah, there are a lot of videos of me where doing religious, just basic, counter apologetic stuff. But but yeah, you're right. There's a lot more on either Jesus myth or things tangential to that, like mythology in the Gospels, for instance, where it's not. Sure. I'm not even specifically saying Jesus didn't exist. I'm just saying the Gospels are full of basic common myth writing, like very clear examples of mythic writing, right. Which is not really controversial. There's lots of mainstream scholars who agree with that. But it still like freaks people out because like, how dare you suggest the Gospels are myth, so that, and it gets tied into the Jesus mythicism stuff.
Sure. But I mean, I myself have looked into a lot of this stuff, and you can see huge similarities between the mythologies. Like the stories were almost carried from one generation to the next. Got
to be careful of that. I would caution people about going too fast with that argument. Because there are a lot of, there are definitely, and that's one of the things that I aim to accomplish with Historicity of Jesus, was to find out what really holds up, and only include in the book what I could back with like actual evidence and sources and scholarship.
Of course.
And there is a lot of bad parallels out there that aren't really real. The Horus and Jesus one is one of the classic examples. Just horrible.
Is that Caesar's Messiah?
No, that's another one that's terrible. For a completely different reason.
Oh, you're talking about the one that was part of that
Zeitgeist, you're thinking.
That's it. Thank you.
Yes. So that's the one that most people know, and that's the one when even mainstream scholars hear about Jesus mythicism, they think I'm another Dorothy Murdoch, that I'm making that kind of argument. It's like, no, I'm not. I've actually like vetted what passes and what doesn't, and wrote a book that got rid of all the bad stuff and only distills as if in a crucible down just what would survive evidential review. So there are parallels definitely, but it looks more like, and I was talking to someone else recently, probably air on some other podcast soon, but I've talked about this, where what it seems to be is not like someone picked someone like Osiris, say, and say, we're just going to make a Jewish Osiris. And then they're just going to copy everything right over. Boom, you got it. That's not what they did. They did that with Moses and Elijah. Like almost all the stories about Jesus are stories about Moses and Elijah that are just updated to a new historical period and to the messaging that they wanted. So there's much more. There are way stronger arguments to show that Jesus is really just a new version of Moses and Elijah. But what they looked at for the mystery cult aspect of Christianity is that there's this whole gamut of these cultural versions of this same mystery cult. There's it's the basic idea of it's an initiatory, membership-driven savior cult movement, where you're usually baptized into it. You have communal meals that bind you to the God, and you get individual salvation in the afterlife, whether by resurrection or some sort of special, you get to go to a special place in the afterlife and so on. Many parallels. This is basically this idea, and there would be secret teachings and so on. Sure. Christianity is clearly a Jewish mystery religion, and there's really no sound argument against this. And I show this in on the Historicity of Jesus. There's a lot of resistance to this idea because it makes people uneasy to admit that this is the case, but that is what it is. This fringe Jewish sect decided to basically create their version, a Jewish version of the mystery religion. And so they borrowed this framework and then put Judaism over it and built a Jewish version of it. And it's not that they're copying a specific one. They're looking at the pattern that is shared by all of these. So you've got Osiris cult, Salmoxis cult. You've got what the equivalent was the Inanna cult. There's Jupiter Dolicanus. There's Bacchus cult. There's the Eleusinian mysteries, which are based on Demeter. And so there are all these different versions of this, and they all share things in common. The same skeleton of a mystery religion, the same features: baptism, initiation, individual salvation, and so on. Many other features. And so they're seeing this cultural pattern. They took the cultural pattern and Judaized it. So it's not that they necessarily stole specific things from Osiris. They might have borrowed a thing here and there or from different gods and stuff. But but it isn't that they're just copying these things. They're making a genuinely unique Jewish version of it. And you can say that of all of them, like Mithraism, Osiris cult, Bacchus cult. They're all unique religions. They're all different from each other. It's what they share in common that shows you the pattern. And that's what Christianity shares in common with them. So yeah, it has a lot of differences, but those differences are the same kind of differences as all these other religions. They're all driven by the local culture that merged with the basic framework. So, the reason I go through all of that is to say, like, we need to be more nuanced in how we argue this, because we don't want to come across as like the crazy Dorothy Murdoch stuff that is highly inaccurate. And as an atheist, you've seen examples where atheists will make a bad argument for atheism.
Oh, yeah.
And that makes atheism look bad and actually reinforces theistic beliefs, because look how stupid the atheist is, therefore I must be right. So it's like, it's better to avoid that. Like, do your best to don't make the bad arguments. Let's make the good arguments. And there is a good version probably of whatever argument that was. And that's the same with mythicism. So I encourage people to make sure you're not making bad mythicist arguments that are easily refuted or easily torn apart. Work at making the good arguments, the arguments that hold up and they're harder to take on. That's my evangelism for Jesus mythicism anyway.
Well, yeah, because somebody, I guess the reason I brought up the Caesar's Messiah, somebody mentioned it in the chat, and I already don't jive with that, or the other one we were talking about too with
Caesar's
Horus.
Messiah.
Caesar's Messiah and the Horus thing, and
the Zeitgeist, right? Yeah,
Zeitgeist. Yeah. But I'll tell you what, though, when I first saw those, I thought it kind of makes sense, and then of course I stumbled upon your stuff, and I was like, okay, now none of that shit makes sense to me anymore.
Yeah, it's easy to do. Like when it was only because I was a graduate student in history that I even thought to fact check Kersey Graves. Like I was like, wow, this is some compelling stuff. But at the same time, I was like, yeah, but is this true? Like, where's his sources? So I was like, I immediately started fact checking it, and that protected me really, which is weird because in high school, this is back, when I was a Taoist, I was going to go into theoretical physics. I was a science guy, and if you had told, I hated history. If you told me I was going to go be like, a niche historian with a PhD in history, I would have said, "There's no way I'm doing that. Are you kidding?" And no, my course of life led to me being a PhD in history of philosophy, at least. So it's at least connected. History of science, it's at least connected, but nonetheless. Wow, a physicist. I wanted to go into string theory. I wanted to go into fundamental theory, explanation of the standard model and stuff like that. So that's what I wanted to do. Understand the core basis of all reality. That's what I wanted to study. But I burned out on academics and went a different direction in life. But that was where I was going back in high school days. Could
you imagine there's an alternate universe out there where you're sitting up there with DeGrasse Tyson or something?
It's possible.
Talking about this stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's not inconceivable.
Well, yeah, I mean, it was a huge interest of mine for ever since I learned about that sort of thing. So I'd always, try and watch stuff based around it. Stuff with Tyson or what's his name that just passed away? Well, not just passed away. Hawking. Sorry.
Oh, Hawking. Hawking. Yes.
Hawking. Yeah, Sagan. I love too. I remember being little and watching his show. Cosmos, right? And of course the reboot, and apparently they're doing another season. Of that one.
That's what I hear.
Which would be really cool because that stuff has always fascinated me. Anything where we get to talk about how all of this came to be is fascinating because
I've I've never lost that interest. So I
Right.
still keep up on the literature, the science, and also many sciences. As a philosopher, I think it's important to be as scientifically literate as I can be. So I know, I actually check all the research. If you're going to talk about the origin of life, I'm going to go read the science on that. I'm going to like try to get it down. And so having that science background helps with that. Like, it makes it easier for me to pick up and read, pick up a research article in any field and read it and understand what's going on.
Sure.
So that's the philosophy side of my life, where I still do contemporary naturalist philosophy, where I'm writing progressive philosophy rather than history of philosophy. So those are the two tracks of my life, basically. Ancient history is one, and the other is philosophy. So I do both. I blog about both. I've written books on both.
Right. Okay, cool. Yeah. Actually, I was just going to pull up my my list here of the books that you've got, because I want to talk a little bit about these. I have a whole list of them right here. So, well, now we were talking originally about the historicity, but let's talk a little bit about one of the ones. I think that I haven't actually read this one yet, and I wanted to get into it because of what I do here on my channel, talking to people about deconversions and stuff. But why I am not a Christian.
Right. Yes. Deliberately written to be short. It's only 90 pages.
Yes.
And cheap. So it's an easy book to get and to hand out to people. And it really cuts to the chase. And it's engineered. I designed that book to specifically maneuver around all the usual responses. Okay. So it's probably one of the best books of mine that you can give a fellow Christian or something like that, and say, this is, I mean, first read it first to see if there's anything in it you disagree with. But apart from that, it's a good one to say, this is why we don't believe in your religion. And it's probably one of the most persuasive short treatises on that I've written for that purpose. So yeah, I like that book. It's handy. And it is the one that I'll refer people to all the time.
Awesome. Now, what about this now? Because you've got the historicity of Jesus, and now there's another one that I noticed that I didn't even know about until literally when I found this stuff.
Yeah, what is it?
Proving history.
Oh yeah, that was the first book that resulted from my research project. So the first thing you do when you take as a PhD historian, first thing you do when you take on a research project is method. You figure out what is the methodology you're going to use, and then you go into application. And when I did that for Jesus studies, I discovered that the methods in Jesus studies were hosed. In fact, every study that was published on the methods by biblical historians themselves, every single study that was focused on the methods concluded that the methods were terrible and didn't work. So it was like, and it was obvious that they were deeply flawed. So I was like, oh my God, this is a mess. How do you solve this problem? One of the things I did, one of my specialties was historiography. So I was studying historical methods, both of ancient historians and of modern historians. I have like a library with a collection of, like a dozen books on historical method that I built up in grad school. So this was historical method was a thing of mine. But trying to explain why certain methods worked and others didn't, why some are valid and weren't, it was not obvious to me. Now, by serendipitous chance, I was fiercely arguing with a Bayesian around this time about how Bayes' theorem can't apply to history. This is stupid. It doesn't work. And I'm like really arguing with this guy. And there was one of those moments when you realize you're wrong. Mm-hmm. I'm like trying to make this point, and I connect some dots. I'm like, oh fuck. This is fucking genius. I'm wrong. I'm massively wrong. And this is brilliant. This actually solves everything, right? So it's like this underlies all historical methods. You can tie it all in together through Bayes' theorem. Sure. And when you understand that, you can look under the hood of any methodology and examine, is this valid, is it not? And you can explain why, which is something that many historians have admitted they can't do. They don't understand what is the logical underpinning of anything they do, really. Bayes' theorem is it, I'm pretty sure. Aviazer Tucker is a philosopher of history who also came to the same conclusion independently of me, and I only discovered after I published Proving History. But that's what Proving History is. So Proving History is, this is the basic methodology that historians should apply. I show how that methodology is Bayes' theorem underlies it. I do a chapter on the methods used in Jesus studies, and I survey all the studies of those methods and why those methods don't work, how you would fix it, and so on. So Proving History is all about historical methodology, with one chapter that focused on the methods applied to Jesus. It's not itself a book arguing Jesus didn't exist, but it does have 2 chapters that argue that the basis for believing he existed is methodologically hosed, and therefore we need to re-examine it afresh with some new, more valid methodology. And so that's Proving History for people who are interested in that. It applies more broadly. It's a whole, it applies to philosophy of history. So if you're interested in historical methodology, historical reasoning, critical thinking, the book is applicable to all of that. Even though the focus is on Jesus, it's not solely about that.
I just got a super chat, and I think they had something they wanted to say. A little, I don't know.
I like the complete absence of any argument. It's a gainsaying. I want to like run the Monty Python skit. I was like, that's not an argument. That's just the automatic gainsaying of anything you say.
That's my friend Nathaniel, I think, that's doing this. I think you probably would have to talk to him one-on-one to hear an actual argument from him.
Right.
I don't think he wanted to fit it all in that little guy right there. Another title that I've yet to read as well that I always thought was kind of an interesting one was Not the Impossible Faith, Why Christianity Didn't Need a Miracle to Succeed.
Yeah, I'm fond of that book too. I tell people it's the most entertaining of my books.
That's what I've been told.
Yeah, especially for an atheist reader. Because the book originated, that's another research project I was hired to do. So there was this guy, J.P. Holding. He's not so big anymore, but back then he was like a significant Christian apologist, or at least internet apologist. And he had a book called The Impossible Faith, about how Christianity was impossible. It should not have succeeded in the ancient world. Therefore, the miracle at the heart of it must be true. Jesus must really have risen from the dead. And that's the whole idea.
Yes, I've heard that argument before.
Yeah, and he listed like 16 reasons or 17 reasons. Yeah, it was 17 reasons why Christianity should have failed, and therefore it must be a miracle, etc. And I had a fan at the time, and I was in grad school. So at that point I had a master's and BA in history. So he wanted to basically hire me. Could you write an extensive rebuttal to this? And so, all right, I'll do that. And so he basically funded me to do that. And I did. And then when I turned it into a book, I deliberately named it Not the Impossible Faith. So when people search for The Impossible Faith on Amazon, my book pops up right underneath his book. So that's the story of that. But it was fun. It's fun in 2 ways for me as a historian. Is that those 17 reasons, and I add an 18th that's kind of like underlying all of his assumptions. So I have 18 chapters in that. And what I found interesting is that like each one of them is making an assertion about the ancient world that is false. So I had an opportunity both to like take down this like silly Christian apologist, and it's fun seeing me debunk and so on. Like debunking is fun to read. Everybody admits this. It's like, it's fun to read debunking literature, catching people out in their mistakes and their silly arguments and so on. So I enjoy that. So that's fun. But at the same time, what I do in each chapter is I show what the actual truth is in the ancient world. And it's much more interesting. So it's educational. So you're actually learning stuff about the ancient world, regardless of what you think about the resurrection hypothesis. Either way, each chapter is educational. You'll learn stuff about the ancient world that'll often be useful for counteracting a lot of the false assumptions that you run into from Christian apologists, because they will often use material similar to similar arguments. Like he wasn't unique in that. You'll hear a lot of these things. Even Gary Habermas had once famously used one of the arguments, which is that for the empty tomb, that women as witnesses were not trusted or legally allowed in court.
Right.
Yeah, that's completely false. Like women were allowed in court as witnesses. There's actually no basis for this. And
they're not even allowed to speak in church, for crying out loud.
Well, but in antiquity they could. They were
true too.
They were not inadmissible witnesses in court. And as historical witnesses for history, which is not a court of law, they were relied on quite a lot. So there's no basis for that. And since then, by the way, Gary Habermas has admitted that that argument doesn't hold up. So he's dropped it from one of his arguments for the empty tomb. But that's an example of where I go through the literature, I show the scholarship, and I show the research, and like, where do their arguments come from? It's from passages in the Talmud and how they're taking them out of context and all of that. So it's useful stuff, I think. So Not the Impossible Faith is both entertaining and educational, and that's one reason why I like it. So I'm very grateful for the patron who funded it.
This is my very good friend Vikram. He lives in the same city as me. He's gonna. Yeah.
So do those things show up to the viewer? I don't know how this works.
Yes, they do.
Okay, yeah, all right.
Yeah. Sorry, Nathaniel. Nathaniel's the divine.
Yeah. This is a great platform, by the way, for video. I like the way it works. StreamYard, I guess, right?
Well,
so
I pay for it, so I get extra stuff. Like I can, as you can see in the corner, I get my branding, and of course we can have our names there. And I can also do other things like this, where I can have little streamers where I can thank my patrons.
Oh, neat! Yeah.
Right. So there you go, and I can also let everyone know, as my friend Prophet of Zod is in the chat as well, who has a channel as well.
June.
And, in June. Yeah, we'll be in Texas. I'll be on the panel this year with those guys. I guess I did something to impress them.
Well, good.
Last year.
Well, I mean, generally, they've done a good job of bringing in interesting YouTubers overall. So, like, I think they've had good roster every year. So it's nice.
Yeah, absolutely. And I went last year, but I wasn't on the panel. I just went and I was handing out, I've got my stickers and stuff, and I was handing these out and say, hey, check out my channel. I talk to people about why they leave religion and other things, like as we're doing now. We're talking about your books and stuff. And speaking of which, one of the titles, Hitler, Homer, Bible, Christ.
What's with the title? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah. People always say that he was an atheist,
Well, that's actually that comes up in that book, but it's really a play on Tinker, Tailor, Soldier, Spy. But I needed a title for a book that ranged across a wide range of bizarre subjects, so I just picked a title that hit all the subjects pretty much. That's basically the context of the book. There's a chapter about Hitler, a chapter about Homer. There's a chapter about there's chapters about the Bible and chapters about Christ. So it's basically, it describes the book.
My cousin, Daniel, calls the New Testament the fan fiction for Judaism. That's what he calls it.
There are better examples of fan fiction analogies, which lead to Christianity. So the Book of Enoch, you know the story. So Christianity is very much born out of that book. So when Christianity began, Enoch was scripture for them. So like a lot of when they cite scripture amongst the body of literature that they consider to be the word of God is the Book of Enoch. So a lot of their ideas are built out of this. But the Book of Enoch is total fan fiction spun out of a single verse in Genesis. There's a line in like Genesis, I think 6:3 or something like that, but where it says it's talking about something else, and then suddenly it says, and then angels came down and had sex with women, and there were giants. And then it moves on. It just doesn't say anything, and you're like, wait, what? Like, let's go back. What are you talking about? So it's just one line, a throwaway line. What the hell is that about? And then the Book of Enoch is someone took that line and was disturbed by like, wow, what's that about? And they just spun it out into like a whole collection of a whole basically Stephen King novel about it. So that's a classic example of fan fiction.
For sure.
In that sense, that led to Christianity. It's a classic piece of that. But to talk about Hitler, Homer, the backstory of that is that when you're a scholar and you publish peer-reviewed works in a journal, you don't get paid for that. You get nothing, not a dime. They turn around and they sell it for tons of money. So like if you want to buy one of my articles through the journal, it'll cost you maybe $35 just for a PDF. I don't get a royalty off of that. I get nothing.
Really?
Nope. Yeah. The scholars that you're buying the articles of, they get zero.
That doesn't sound
it all goes to the corporation that owns the journal.
Lord.
Yeah. No, it's.
Is there no trickle down from the corporation to you at all for any of this?
No, not at all. But the contracts that you sign with these academic journals, usually the contract will say you can republish this in an anthology of your own works. In other words, you haven't surrendered the rights altogether. You can do this. So I was like, well, I can self-publish. I'll just self-publish an anthology of my own works and put all my peer-reviewed work in it. So for $20, you can get basically hundreds of dollars worth of articles. By the way, they charge you. So if you want to get my peer-reviewed articles, you can get copies of them. In the subject of history, you can get copies of them all in Hitler Homer. I'm waiting for enough peer-reviewed articles by me in philosophy to do the same thing with philosophy. So
Cool.
that hasn't happened yet, but it's on my to-do list. Things.
By the way, guys, if you want probably I consider it probably to be the most reliable source website for peer-reviewed articles on pretty much anything, this is the one you go to right here, the Clarivate Master Journal List, and it'll give you anything and everything that's in some form of a journal that you can get through them as well.
Interesting. Yeah.
They're really, really good. They have lists of everything, any journals,
right?
Scientific journals, of course, but anyway.
Okay. Yeah.
There you go. So I thought I'd share that with them. I do that every once in a while, especially when we start bringing up stuff about journals and peer review and stuff like that. Prophet says you get the sweet endorsement deals. Yeah. So basically, I guess then that book that we were talking about there, the Hitler, Homer, Bible, Christ one is like a collection of those works of you, basically. The journals and stuff, or the peer review stuff that you were talking about. You mean,
I'm sorry, ask that question again.
The book, the Hitler, Homer, Bible, Christ, is the collection of the works that you've done for peer review.
Yeah, including it includes all my peer-reviewed history articles. It includes my magazine articles. So I wrote several articles for Skeptical Inquirer. They were in there.
Right. I think I've seen a couple of them.
Yeah, there's a few research papers and then a few key blogs that I've reorganized that are essential that fill it out. But yeah, it touches on a lot of subjects. It also includes the German Studies Review article I was just talking about.
Cool.
On Hitler's Table Talk. And then I put out an epilogue at the back of it so you can see what's happened since then, at least up to the publication of Hitler, Homer, Bible, Christ. But so that's the usefulness of that book, is that you get a zillion articles on a variety of different subjects, and some of them are peer-reviewed, some of them are magazine articles, and so on. So that's the value of that book for people who are interested in that sort of stuff.
Excellent. Okay, now one more book I want to talk about and I saved this one for last because historically it's one of my favorite eras to talk about, and The Scientist in the Early Roman Empire.
Yes.
I have yet to read this. I've sort of been saving it until I've gone through all your other books because it's one of my favorite sort of topics. Because anything and everything to do with Rome I've watched because it was just it's fascinating to me, right? Or I've read stuff.
That was my field. I studied under William Harris, who wrote the famous book on Roman imperialism, Roman literacy, or ancient literacy, various other things. So so it's two books, right? There's Science Education in the Early Roman Empire. It's a short little book just on education. And it covers the whole education system in the ancient world, but it then focuses on science, but it does everything. And then the bigger book, which is The Scientist in the Early Roman Empire, like you said, and that all comes out of my dissertation. There was work I did on the Christian stuff that wasn't in the dissertation that I put in the publication, but otherwise, it's the okay, that's a completely unrelated subject popping up.
Yes, but I just wanted to, before it scrolled past, I wanted you to get the accolades.
Someday I would love to do this. Segue on that. Someday I would love to do a proper, formal, written debate with Sargon on something, anything. It doesn't matter what it is, because
he's quite the character, that guy.
Yeah. Well, then he does a lot of visual and auditory rhetoric. Like a lot of what he does is manipulation of emotion through conversation. But if it's just calm, emotion-free facts, and you have time to fact check everything before you post it, I'm not sure he'd do so well. So just saying. But he also, by the way, is a fan of ancient Rome. So he likes that stuff as well. But this is a subject I really love, ancient science.
Yeah,
because it's
me too.
so badly misunderstood and usually
Exactly.
misrepresented by Christians, especially.
Yep.
And that's how I got into that. Actually, that was when I was digging around for a subject for my dissertation. I toyed with doing a dissertation on ancient skepticism, ancient supernaturalism, something like that. At the time I had encountered, there was the arguments of Stanley Yaki, I think, various other Christian apologists who were arguing that science was stillborn in the ancient world. They didn't do any real science. It was the Christians that invented science and everything, and that you have to have the Bible to even understand, to come up with the idea of science and so on. And these things are like crazily.
Wait, what?
Yeah. Well, for people who want to see this, I have quotations of these Christian apologists. Multiple books have argued this. It's in The Christian Delusion. So John Loftus's anthology, which is a really good anthology, many great authors of stuff in it. The Christian Delusion. One of my chapters in there. One is on the resurrection apologetics, but the other is on this argument that Christianity and the Bible were necessary for science, and ancient science was shit. And here's all the reasons why ancient science was shit. It's completely ignorant in so many ways. It just outraged me as a historian of antiquity. I wanted to do something on this, and I wrote. But that led me to ask an interesting question of myself, which was, why didn't the scientific revolution happen in ancient Rome? That's a valid question, right? And it turns out someone wrote about this. H. Flores Cohen wrote a whole book on the scientific revolution, on the historiography of the scientific revolution. So he wrote a book about the books about the scientific revolution. So it's basically a book about how historians treat this subject. And he had a whole chapter on why it didn't happen in the ancient world. And he surveys what scholars have said about this and stuff. And I was outraged again. These weren't all Christian scholars, but some of them were. But they were also saying invalid, wrong things. And I was like, And so I wanted to do my own dissertation on why it didn't happen in the ancient world. And I had this 10-point list of things that based on Cohen's work, we were saying there were 10 things that need to be explained and so on. I wrote a prospectus, presented it to William Harris at Columbia, and he said, okay, that's 10 dissertations. Pick one. And so I picked attitudes, the argument that the ancients dismissed scientists. They were indifferent to science. They didn't think it was important. So what was the attitudes towards actual science and scientists in the ancient world? And I did my dissertation on that. And that ended up touching on almost everything anyway. And so I actually got everything pulled in a little bit, but I was able to focus on just that one thesis as the focus of the dissertation. But it results in the book you're talking about, where I go into what did the ancients actually say and think about scientists, and who were these guys? What did they actually think and do? And then I do all the pagan stuff, and then I throw in a chapter on contrasting that with what Christians said, which is the exact opposite of everything the pagans were saying about science.
Of course,
which gives you a nuanced way into the conflict between science and religion, which has not been, the mythology is that Christians were burning scientists and burning science books. It's not true. They weren't doing that. The reality is that they were hostile to the values necessary for science, which are curiosity. You have to believe that curiosity is a moral good and is worth pursuing, and not something that's dangerous. So Christians thought curiosity was dangerous. They had a lot of literature about curiosity leads to heresy. Don't do it. This is bad. Get away from this.
That's where the whole "don't question" comes up.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's an extreme version of that. But even just this idea that curiosity is suspicious, it's not something that's admirable. And empiricism, which is that facts trump all authority. Well, Christians couldn't have that. No. Scripture trumps all facts. That was there, and then maybe the Pope eventually. But it was mostly that was Scripture. The Pope is God. Facts cannot trump these authorities. You cannot contradict these things with facts. If there's a contradiction, you've either misunderstood the Bible or there's something wrong with your facts. But the idea that facts can determine what's true, that idea of empiricism was rejected. And then the other is progress, the belief that progress in knowledge and in technology and things is not only possible, but valuable. And the Christians thought it was not even possible and that it wasn't valuable. It wasn't worth anything. And I show this with quotations. You can see this was the early view. They were against the values. They didn't tie this in. They didn't say science is evil. They were just hostile to these separate values, not realizing that this results in people being disinterested in science. And then when you get to the Middle Ages, it wasn't hostility, it was just disinterest. They just weren't interested. They didn't do real scientific research because they didn't care. Insofar as they used previously achieved science, pagan science, they found it useful, they used it, but they didn't build on it. They didn't look into the methodologies of how it was acquired. And so that was the reality of what happened. It was so there is a hostility between religion and science. It's not direct. It comes at you sideways. And that had to be overcome. When you look at like John Locke and these other early authors that are trying, in Galileo, but also Gilbert, Vesalius, they're all trying to argue for the resurrection, basically, of these pagan ideals. They have opposition amongst the Christian elite. They have to argue against these Christian arguments, against curiosity, against progress, against empiricism. And they won eventually, but it was hard fought. It took hundreds of years. But it was, and these were, and let's be fair, these were Christians making these arguments. So it was, it wasn't that all Christians were completely hostile to science, but these Christians realized that pagan values needed to be reintegrated into Christianity so that we could have these great things.
Now, what do you think about, like, I've heard people say, this scientist or that scientist, they were actually Christians. I'm like, and I've heard the argument that was raised that to claim that you weren't could have been dangerous.
Yeah, well, I do make that point, yeah.
Right?
In the Christian Delusion article chapter, that is one of the points I make, is like, what else could you do? If you're going to argue for this, even like when they find arguments from Scripture, they're really stretching, right? They're like stretching to find... But that's what you had to do. Like, you had to like somehow make up a reason that this was scriptural. It's not scriptural, but you have no other way forward. You can't if you don't have scripture on your side, you're fucked. And we see that with slavery, right? Like there's really nothing in the Bible that helps you argue against slavery. Like, not really. Like, you have to stretch some things pretty far and ignore a lot of stuff. Yeah. And so the abolitionists, of course, had to have the Bible on their side. But of course, this pro-slave party also, they had much clearer, like,
both of them were claiming to have
very black, but the pro-slavery party had black letter law right out of God's mouth. Slavery is cool, guys. Yeah. So the abolitionists had to like make shit up, like try to like twist and like, start with something about the golden rule and then like step, hand wave, then our argument, right? That's how they had to do that. But that's how they had to do it. Like you couldn't make this. You couldn't go through making a atheist argument, because then you'd just be condemned as an atheist, and your whole abolitionist movement is gone. So, but yeah, like you said, like you had to do that. You had to be a Christian, and you had to make what sounded like Christian arguments. That does not mean that these ideas came out of Christianity. They really didn't. They had to be reframed in Christian terms just to make them palatable. That's what happened.
What seems like ultimately may have been a problem for a lot of people now, trying to argue that they weren't, that this didn't come like. That's why I think we get these arguments from believers, or especially fundamentalists, where they say, "Oh yeah, science and religion are compatible." Because I hear that a lot, right? And they bring up these guys. Oh, but they were Christians, and they said that it was through Scripture that it was okay, and it's like, or that they found out all this stuff, or that science was found out by Christians, and it's like, all right, I'm not going to get into this with you right now.
Yeah, no, I mean, I understand what they're trying to do, but they're not thinking in terms of historical context. And I turn this around. I say, like, all the greatest, the dawn of science, the invention of science itself, and some of the greatest science done by Aristotle, Archimedes, Herophilus. These are pagans. Yep. So are you now going to argue that paganism, therefore, is necessary for science? That paganism is true because only pagans can come up with science?
I was a pagan for some years, actually.
But you see, the point is, like, they would immediately see that that's a stupid argument once you frame it in those terms.
That's actually a good idea.
Right. If you can get them to realize, like, oh, okay, I'm doing the same thing. That is kind of a dumb argument. I really shouldn't be saying that. I mean, that's my way in. I always look for, like, let's look at another context. Does your argument hold up in that context? And can you see the analogy? And that's usually the best way forward. There are people who will be sternly resistant to this mode of argumentation. You can't convince them of anything, but some people will see it and will get it. And that's how you get them out. Like, I know, like, that's how you deconvert people ultimately. The ones who do get out, it's through things like that that gets them out.
Yeah. Yes. Science and religion are compatible only if religion does backflips.
And it has a very short memory.
Yes, indeed.
Have to pretend you didn't say things you said 50 years ago, right? Like, change your theology. It's like, oh, okay, yeah, okay. Genesis is all metaphor. Okay, there's no Adam and Eve. That's all metaphor. This creates a problem for our whole atonement theology, but we'll plaster over that. Okay, the brain is necessary for the mind, but God must have intended that. Okay, there's no soul, but soul must have been a metaphor. It's like that's all this. Flipping around. Or what they'll do is they'll try to stick with an anti-scientific position, like the soul exists, a disembodied soul is possible. And then they will
what contains it.
Right, and they'll say, like, well, science is wrong about everything, and it's like, you do realize you're pointing out a conflict between your views and science. But then they'll try to say, like, but if you ignore the dogmas and the bias of science, you can cherry pick scientific data to get what we want, and they'll say that, and then that'll turn into science supports our position.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of twisting of logic there to get to that. This came up recently in my PragerU article just on my blog, where they do exactly this. So they say science supports theism, and here's why. Which is what they have to do, right? And so that's where they it's not religion doing backflips, it's religion forcing science to do backflips by inventing a fictional version of science and animating its backflips, and then saying, science supports us. So yeah, right. That's the problem, is that you have to do one or the other. And yeah, it does require a short memory. It requires assuming that everything you said 50 years ago hasn't been refuted, and that you've just completely changed your position in order to keep up with science.
Yeah, it's hysterical. What's his name? Mr. Deity Brian actually likes to talk or tackle PragerU quite a bit. Oh,
does he? Okay, yeah.
Mm-hmm. He's always going on about. And he's really good at pointing out just how ridiculous they sound.
Oh, yeah. So. No, it's. I'm sorry, it is low hanging fruit. I'll be honest, but
it is.
But it gets a lot of attention, so it's one of those things. And normally I would ignore it, but they have a lot of views. They have a lot of viewers. It's influential, so you do have to write something about it.
For sure. Well, Richard, we have come to the top of the hour.
Yeah.
So, and I usually keep these interviews to about an hour.
Good. Yeah.
I've gone over before, but as we talked about earlier, I usually do an after party. You don't have to join; like, you're not obligated. I would never say no. I'm sorry, but you're my guest.
I think I'm feeling good for that. I'll hit the restroom. I'll pour myself some more bourbon, and then I'll be good.
Excellent idea. So. I'm all out of scotch. I usually drink like Glenfiddich or something, but
oh, nice. Yeah, I like it.
I'm a big scotch guy.
Well, today, and other people might recognize, I have Basil Hayden's.
Oh, nice. That's good stuff.
Yeah, it's my favorite bourbon. So it's what I've got on hand right now.
All right, I've just got my case of this was like the stuff that my dad drank. It's called Old Style Pilsner. So,
all right.
Because I like Pilsners, and then it's weird. I like an extreme in the beers. I like the Pilsners, and then I like the really, really dark ales like Aran.
Okay.
Aran,
yeah. Right. So, I know. I've been out drinking with Aran before.
Me too. And last year, one of the best parts about being at Faithless Foreign was hanging out with Aran, because he would not let me be empty-handed. He would not let me not have beer in my hand. One time I had two going. I'm like, what the hell's going on?
Very good. Okay.
Thanks for making me an alcoholic, Aran. Anyways.
So to the after party, do we do like a separate video? How does that work?
Yes, I have it already set up, and I'll send you a new link.
Excellent.
And there's going to be a few people that are going to probably want to pop in and say hello, because they're big fans and stuff like that, and ask you a couple questions.
All right.
And they can go for an undetermined amount of time, but you stick around for as long as you're comfortable doing so.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. And I just want to say thank you so much for joining me today, Richard. I got to admit, I'm kind of fanboying a little bit here, because I've been, like I told you before we got going, I've been watching your stuff for well over 6 years. And it's just really cool to actually be sitting here talking to you.
Oh, good. Thank you. I'm glad of that. All right.
And all right, guys, thank you guys for hanging out with Richard and I while we talked about some really interesting stuff. So if you guys do have any questions and you would like to be involved in the after party, let me know through Twitter or Facebook, and I'll send you a link and you can join us. And remember that we can have 4 guests other than Richard and myself in this format because StreamYard only allows 6 in one chat room at a time. So do let me know. And also, if you guys do like what I do here, I also have links below how you can support the show. There's a few of them there. My Patreon, my PayPal, my Amazon wish list. And also I have all the links for Richard's Carrier's, or for, I should call you Doctor, really. Dr. Carrier's stuff down below.
It's fine.
Richard's fine? Okay.
Yeah,
Well, I guess we're on a first name basis now. All right, guys, there are links below. You can pick up all the books we've been talking about, which I highly recommend. I have 3 of them myself, but and more to come. I actually do have the one about the but I want to read all your other stuff before I get into that because that's like one of my favorite subjects, right? And I just picked up today, I picked up the historicity of Jesus on Audible. So, because I like to listen to stuff while I'm at work as well.
Okay.
All right, guys. Thanks again. And thanks again, Dr. Carrier, for being here with me. And we will see you guys next time. And like I always say at the end of these things, like the late, great Christopher Hitchens once said, it's called faith because it's not knowledge. And we'll see you guys next time.